Hi, everyone. So you may have believed, following my um, finishing of the 8 functions, that I had stopped explaining things correctly. Well, you couldn't be more wrong. I haven't finished. I've got more to cover. And today I'm going to be starting the 4 Jungian dichotomies and explaining them correctly. But before I do that, let me just take a moment to pat myself on the back because I've got 2,000 subscribers. That is utterly puny and pathetic compared to the many illustrious YouTube typologists with up to 57,000 subscribers. But for socionics, such a small step is actually a giant leap. We don't tend to have a very large audience, not compared to our MBTI cousins, but it is good to see that people are taking more of an interest in this channel. So thank you everyone for subscribing. If you haven't subscribed, please remember to subscribe. And if you want to get an extra fast notification that I'm about to put my fat face on this screen, well, click that little notification bell. But yes, let's turn back to the topic of the day, which is the Jungian dichotomies, and specifically extrovert versus introvert. So why am I talking about the Jungian dichotomies? So first of all, what are they? They are the dichotomies which Jung came up with in his psychological types. They were then taken by um, the Myers-Briggs type indicator in essentially being the beginning, middle, and end of their test for working out type. The difficulty there is that when Jung coined these dichotomies, they were intrinsically tied to the particular types and which he had formed out of the cognitive functions. The cognitive functions themselves were built out of these 4 dichotomies. So the way that the test uses them is simply to assume that if you put extrovert and intuitive and thinking and perceiving together, you have a type, the ENTP, which will necessarily have extroverted intuition in the dominant function, introverted thinking in the auxiliary function, extroverted feeling in the tertiary function, and introverted sensing in the inferior function. And of course, the other 4 if you want to go into Beebe's model. But there is no guarantee that's the case. Yes, you could get close to that guarantee if you were absolutely sure that the dichotomies you were using were so carefully defined that they match up perfectly to what it means to have, say, to be extroverted and intuitive and perceiving. That matches up perfectly to what it means to have extroverted intuition in the dominant function. But there's nothing to really to be found in the way that extroversion versus introversion is tested for, that or even how intuition is tested for. That would really tell you that you actually have extrovert intuition in the dominant function. So if you take that kind of issue and you spread that out across the 16 types, you're going to get a whole load of mistypes. And we do. Lots of people are mistyped. I would hazard a guess and say most people are perhaps mistyped, especially in the Myers-Briggs type community. I would say in the socionics community, even then it's hard. I think even then, a sizable minority maybe mistyped unless they've actually had either got a very strong knowledge of a theory or they've gone through it with a decent socionist to find out their type. Even then, it's not perfect. There's still mistakes which can be made. So yeah, I actually say most people in the Myers-Briggs type community, because of the discrepancies between the Jungian dichotomies, at least the way the Myers-Briggs type indicator uses them, and the cognitive functions, actually have mistypes. You could look at it a different way. You could say, well, no, they're not mistyped because whatever the test says they are, that is their type. Fair enough. But then it's no longer Jungian. It's separated itself from the cognitive functions because you need cognitive functions for it to be Jungian. That's what Jung created. The whole point of the Jungian dichotomies were to distinguish the cognitive functions. So if you bite the bullet and say that, oh no, it's what the test tells you, that is your type, that is accurate, then you've given up being Jungian. It's no longer Jungian typology. Now, someone who did bite the bullet, and that was Keirsey. Keirsey's temperament sorter does not have any mention of cognitive functions. This is simply the combinations of the letters. And yeah, that's not Jungian. That might as well be a big 4 rather than a big 5, except that it uses types rather than spectra based on traits. It's no longer got that connection to Jungian cognitive functions. But yes, if you want an understanding of Jungian cognitive functions, then we need to address this very thorny issue. So what I like to do is I like to use socionics because it has far clearer definitions, and those clear definitions are necessarily tied to the what I call the information metabolism elements arranged in the 8 functions of Model A. They are intrinsically connected. The definition of extraversion and introversion should and almost must come from what lies under the hood, rather than try to sort of post hoc theorize what under the hood must be based on the dichotomies we've quite arbitrarily put together. And that is a major issue. So when I think of an extrovert versus an introvert, in a more correct way, you could say, I'm not falling into some of the traps which people who look at Myers-Briggs tend to fall into. Now, there is some more complexity here. You could say that even the popular Myers-Briggs understanding of extrovert and introvert is not even correct via Myers-Briggs. Some people take the extrovert to mean someone who gets their energy from interacting with people, and an introvert is someone who gets their introvert from spending time alone. That is not really accurate by the Myers-Briggs standard, at least the official Myers-Briggs Foundation. It's not about interacting with people or spending time on your own. That would already be very problematic for socionics because that is already slanting a definition of extrovert and introvert towards interpersonal interaction versus not interpersonal interaction, or just thinking on your own, you could say. And that inevitably would lead to more sensing feeling types ending up as more likely to be mistyped as extrovert if they're introverted, and intuitive thinking types as more likely to be mistyped introverted even if they're extroverted. And unfortunately, we do see that quite a bit, even having taken the official test. We see that a lot of ENTJs are actually not. That a lot of ENTJs are actually end up being typed as INTJ because they've been bumped to introvert rather than kept as extrovert because their extroversion hasn't been read properly by the test because they're intuitive in their thinking. And similarly, you will get a number of ISF, you could say ISFPs, I would say, although although in Myers-Briggs SIFE, you might have it put as an ISFJ, whatever that ISF types get essentially mistyped as ESF types, as ESFJs, because again, their introversion has not been picked up by the test and has been confused for their sensing feeling preference. So what does that look like? So essentially, ENTJs are not very sociable. They are going to be very independently minded people. They are going to be very much about exercising their extroversion through extroverted thinking and extroverted sensing, and with introverted intuition being a sort of auxiliary or creative function, helping out extroverted thinking. So nothing of that is anything to do with interacting with people. It's very independent. It's very much about being task focused and getting things done. So there's nothing there that would really lead to someone scoring as an extrovert. In fact, you ask them, I'd like to go to parties. An ENTJ will probably say, no, I don't like to go to parties. Make me an introvert. That's one of the key problems. Same way, the SF types, if they are actually introverted, even if they are introverted, they'll be highly sociable people. They're going to want to spend time with others. They learn by interacting with others. Social interaction in the moment, interpersonal, is how they learn. It's where they're at their strongest. So they're actually going to be very sociable people, even if they're actually relatively rather low energy people who tend to do a few things rather take on lots of different things. My wife is an example of someone who isn't particularly high energy. She is someone who likes her day-to-day comfort, sticks to a few things in general, can easily be overwhelmed by too much, right? But if she were to take a Myers-Briggs test and she did a sort of community event Myers-Briggs workshop, she came out as an extrovert because she is sociable. She's more sociable than I am. She's got a friend round right now, right? And I'm up here, not talking to her friend, right? I'm up here doing my theoretical stuff, right? So yeah, doesn't work. Really does not work. This is how you get mistypes. So no, I'm going to get you an accurate definition. Well, first of all, I should say, what is the proper Myers-Briggs definition, not this sort of socializing versus not socializing? The proper definition of the Myers-Briggs Foundation is that do you get your energy, is your energy directed towards the outer world if you're an extrovert, or towards the inner world if you're an introvert? That also has problems because no one is clear in defining what the outer world is compared to the inner world. If you go to Jung, he talks about an orientation towards the object versus the subject, the self towards the thing rather than orientation towards the thing itself. But that's not exactly the same from what the Myers-Briggs says about the outer world versus the inner world. And if you're testing based off the outer world versus the inner world rather than object versus subject orientation, then again, you're going to be disconnected from the cognitive functions as Jung described them. So it's all a bit of a mess, really. And I'd like to see someone explain to me, for instance, why is it that an ENTP like myself would be more oriented towards the outer world rather than the inner world? Show me what I'm using extrovert intuition as my dominant function, right? So I've got lots of new ideas. I come up with new stuff all the time. I like thinking outside the box. But how is that tied to the outer world? What is it in my outer world that I am directing my energy towards? It's not clear. It's quite a vague thing. The more you look at it, the more it sort of falls apart. What is outer world versus inner world? Is the wall behind me my outer world? Is me talking to you the outer world? Um, and the same thing for someone who be, say, an ISFP, right? Introverted sensing in the dominant function, right? What would be their orientation towards the inner world? How is their sensing inner? Where do you find it? Do I have to become like, I don't know, some sort of nasty butcher and cut them open to find their sensing within them? What is mean by inner and outer? So this whole difficulty is, I think, from that conflation I talked about before, about the conflation between extrovert and introvert and external versus internal. I think outer and inner should really be put onto sensation and thinking being outer and intuition and feeling being inner. So that shouldn't be what extrovert and introvert is about. Instead, I talked about in my going over the information metabolism elements, how all the extroverted elements are turning outwards, you could say. Not located outwards, but turning outwards. What I mean by turning outwards, I mean orientation towards breadth, quantity, acquiring more and more and more and more and more things that are made off of that element. And the introverted elements are not doing that. They're not expanding the quantity of things. They're turning within. And what I mean by turning it within, I don't mean being located internally to us, but rather are refining things down to the few, to refine the quality of what we have collected. So, breadth versus depth orientation, an attitude towards quantity, expanding the quantity versus refining the quality. Now, if you think of it in that way, extrovert and introvert become something quite clear, but not actually to do with what's inside of us versus outside of us. Now, I do think Jung is right in terms of this idea of, well, the Myers-Briggs Foundation is right in terms of this idea of direction of energy. I think energy is still very important here, but it's what is the thing the energy is being sent towards that I think is the source of this confusion. So this takes me to the Model A, the 8 functions we went through over the previous 8 videos. How does that link to extroversion and introversion? Because that's really the point, really. you have to have that direct connection. You need to have your Jungian dichotomies and all the other type dichotomies, because actually there are 15 type dichotomies, not just 4. You need to have those 4 dichotomies defined very clearly based on the makeup of functions for each particular type. That is where it should come from. If it doesn't come from there, you've got 2 different potentially contradicting systems, not the same integrated system. So what is that definition then? Well, let's look again at our wonderfully drawn board of, well, more like a paper page of the functions. Now, the idea is that the placement of the elements, the extrovert intuition, extroverted sensing, whatever it is, into these 8 functions should therefore, in the right combination, create either an extrovert or an introvert. So what is that combination? Well, the combination should be where the extroverted elements, so we're talking about extroverted thinking, which is pragmatism, extroverted sensing, which is force, extroverted intuition, which is ideas, and extroverted ethics, which is emotions, right? They should all go into those functions, which I would say are obvious rather than subtle. So what are obvious functions? Which one of these 8 are the obvious ones? Well, we know that the leading one is going to be obvious. That kind of makes sense. The dominant function, the big one, that's going to be obviously the obvious one. It's going to show up the most. But it's not just a leading function. Don't just look at it in terms of a leading function. You've got to also look at it in terms of the demonstrator function. That is also obvious. You've also got the role function. That is obvious. And you've got the mobilizing function, number 6. That is also going to be obvious, right? And the other ones, the creative or auxiliary, you could call it, the vulnerable or the blind spot or the trickster, the suggestive or inferior, and the ignoring or the oppositional, these are all going to be subtle, not obvious, right? So what does it mean to be obvious? What does it mean to be subtle? So these functions which are obvious, they have more energy diverted towards them. They have a high flow of energy, which means they become obvious because they're essentially shining brighter, you could say, in the personality. I'm speaking very figuratively. It does not really have more lumens. It's that when you see someone in their behavior, how they're interacting, the obvious functions are going to be showing up more clearly. They are going to be more readily doing those things. This has nothing to do with how strong they are at doing it, just that there's more energy being applied towards it. You could have perhaps too much energy for your competence, and so you do too much and you actually fall flat on your face. Similarly, you could be very good at something and have actually rather little energy just sent towards it. So you're more sort of minimalist or adaptive or reactive in how you use it rather than utilizing it all the time. So that's the idea of energy. It should overall lead to the extroverted elements. If you are an extrovert, which means your extroverted elements are in your obvious functions, it should lead to them showing up more. If you're an introvert, all your introverted elements are going to be in your subtle functions. If you're an introvert, all your introverted elements are going to be in your obvious functions, and your extroverted elements are going to be in your subtle functions. So suddenly the introverted ones, so laws, introverted logic, telos, introverted intuition, senses, introverted sensing, and relations, introverted ethics, those are the ones which are going to be now showing up more with brighter lumens, you could say, and more obviously in the type. So what does that look like? Well, the idea is that because you've got 4 different things shining more brightly, figuratively speaking, and another 4 shining less brightly, figuratively speaking, that leads to a lot of variation. It's very hard to really pin down very key specific traits which are common for 8 different extroverted types that are different to 8 different introverted types. It's not actually very useful to put together a questionnaire that then tries to test you based on you showing these said traits which are supposedly common to 8 and not common to the other 8. This is why I don't like these dichotomy tests. I think they are a recipe for failure. But if we are going to articulate something in common with all 8, when we can, it's just going to be very abstracted because it needs to sit across 8 very, very different types, from an ENTP to an ESFJ or an ESFP. Very, very different. So what are these similarities? What comes out of having extroverted elements in obvious functions and introverted elements in subtle functions? And how is that different from having introverted elements in obvious functions and extroverted elements in subtle functions? Well, as I said before, extraversion is about expanding the quantity rather than refining the quality. So what you'd expect is that the extroverts should have more energy moved towards expanding the quantity and less energy towards refining the quality overall. And you'll find with introverts, it's the other way around. More of their energy is towards refining the quality, less of it towards expanding the quantity. And sure, they'll be able to do both. That it's not as if they can't. This is why it's not clear cut. But rather, when you see it in aggregate, you'll find that there's an overall lesser use of the introvertedness by the extroverts and a lesser use of the extrovertedness by the introverts. And you'll see that particularly where something is low energy, so it is subtle, but it's also weak. And that takes us back here, and you'll see the suggestive function, but also the vulnerable function. These are both weak, but so are the role and mobilizing. What makes the suggestive and vulnerable, or you could say the inferior and the trickster, right? What makes them more absent? It's that they have lower energy, whereas the mobilizing and role actually quite high energy despite being weak. So that means that if you have something which is low energy and it's weak, you're using it hardly any at all. It's basically continuously on the dimmer switch. Low, low energy being ascribed towards it. You basically don't see that being used. These are the absences you're going to see in the type. So when you look at the type, you'll find that they may be using their strong, if they're extroverted, they may be using their stronger introverted parts situationally. For instance, I use quite a bit of introverted thinking. It's quite clear from me doing this whole series. But what I'm not showing is much introverted sensing and introverted feeling. Those are going to be my distinct absences, even while I use quite a bit more of my extroverted sensing and my extroverted feeling, despite being an ENTP. So that is kind of what you'll see, is that in aggregate, there'll be less introversion in the extrovert and less extroversion in the introvert because of these two missing components, you could say, because they're both weak and they're also subtle. So yeah, that is the idea. And overall, what can you see in certain behaviors? This means that overall, in aggregate, the extroverts are going to be starting more things up. They're going to be getting more things going. They're going to be about accumulating more and more different experiences or responsibilities or whatever desires or things they want. They're just going to be doing more and more and more of it. There's more of an energy there. You'll find that extroverts in general tend to be more charismatic, tend to be more productive and pragmatic, tend to be more likely to think outside of the box and go towards a breadth of different ideas, and they are more likely to be more assertive and a bit more dominant and a bit more oomphy, you could say, overall. And the introverts overall, they are going to be about refining that quality more so. So they are going to be more likely to be tying things up once they've been started, finishing things off, making sure whatever is there is actually making sense. They feel all right with it. They're comfortable with it. It all sort of clues together for them. They'll be more reflective on how they feel about it, what they think about it, how it all makes sense than the extrovert will. They're going to be more likely to take some of their time with something to make sure it fits together more than the extrovert. You say the extrovert is starting it all up, the introvert is carefully tying it together. The extrovert jumps out the house with their shoelaces undone. The introvert spends quite a bit of time getting their shoelaces done and might not get out the house at all. That is a very general, simplified way of looking at it. But what you'll find with the introverts is that overall, they tend to be more long-term oriented than the extroverts. They tend to be overall more aware of how comfortable they are in a situation, whether the details are coming together better than the extroverts overall. They're going to be more about whether things actually fit together and cohere. They'll be more inclined to be able to spot contradictions in what they're doing than the extroverts are. And they're going to be more aware of their personal attitudes and their likes and dislikes towards people and others and other things, then again, the extroverts will. So this is why I say it. You can put together something, but it's very much a sort of general in aggregate. But the key thing is that the extroverts direct more energy towards extroverting things, and the introverts direct more energy towards introverting things. That is it. So this is also why I actually like to call extroverts and introverts energizers and integrators. The extroverts overall are energizing the space, they're getting things going, getting things moving, and the introverts are kind of integrating it. They're trying to make sure that what is there is actually coming together properly. It is right. It is well, it is important. It's significant. It is going in the right sort of direction. It makes sense. All that sort of thing. So yeah, this is why I say it exists as a dichotomy. You need to understand it correctly, and I wouldn't overuse it to the point where I'd use it on its own in the test, like extrovert versus introvert. Where extrovert and introversion is very useful is when you put it with other things. So you know someone's intuitive, and you know they are extroverted. Then you start getting useful things, because now you know, oh, extroverted intuition is going to be 4-dimensional, and introverted sensing is going to be 1-dimensional. In other words, strong and obvious versus weak and subtle. And that's when you start being able to see real differences. You'll know from that person's going to be very ideas oriented. They're not going to be very detail oriented. So that's when it starts to become useful. But yeah, having a test to work out if you're an extrovert or an introvert without looking at the cognitive functions making it up, or the information elements in their particular functions of Model A making it up, I think is basically a waste of time. And that, unfortunately, is the fatal flaw of the Myers-Briggs type indicator. The Myers-Briggs type indicator would be far better off if it just said it's not a Jungian psychology or typology at all, and just basically might as well just be the Keirsey temperament sorter, or the Keirsey temperament sorter might just be seeing itself as a sort of smaller version of the Big Five, which hasn't quite gotten accustomed to the idea that its lack of bimodal variation suggests that actually it's dealing with traits rather than types. So yeah, I hope that helps. I'll cover sensing versus intuition next. One thing I should say before I end, I am actually working on a course. I say I'm working on it. I pretty much completed it. I'm just uploading the last few recordings. I've already done the pilot. If you would like to learn more about socionics, which is the theory which I practice, yes, please reach out to me. Send an email to worldsocionics@hotmail.com, and you'll be able to sign up to that course. It is a paid course. It's not free. The full price, you could say, is £600, but you can get discounts, especially if you buy it all at once rather than get it module by module. And you can get it by module. Each module is going to be essentially, it depends on the size of the module. Some are £80, some are £160, some are £40. But yeah, depending on what works for you, if you get it all at once, it's actually discounted to £540. But yeah, if you'd like to take the course and learn about socionics in depth, know all that I know about socionics, then yeah, take this course. Anyway, thank you very much. Have a lovely day. I'll cover sensing intuition next.